Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you follow this show with any regularity, you know we talk a lot about politics and things that are connected very closely to our planet. And tonight, we'll be, in a manner of speaking, leaving the planet and talking about astronomy and how anyone, as an amateur astronomer, can delve into the great mystic beyond, right? So, Mark Christensen, Mark Wagner, yes. I knew this before the show started. Mark Wagner and Mark Christensen, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Let's start with a little bit about the organization you represent, which is the Fox Valley Astronomical Society, located in Fox Valley, not surprisingly. So, Mark, you, Mark, are the president, and Mark, you, Mark, are the vice president, right?
Correct.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about what the society is and how it got started and how you guys got involved, Mark.
Okay. The Astronomy Club was organized in 1944 as a non-profit organization. And our charter really is to bring astronomy to the public and to widen the knowledge of people and for astronomy and that type of thing. We give public star parties once a month at Peck Farm Park, and we have a regular club meeting once a month at the same location.
And Peck Farm Park is where?
That is on, what street is it on?
Caneville Road.
Caneville Road.
In Geneva.
In Geneva.
Okay.
So it's west of Randall Road and Fabian.
Okay.
And Peck Farm Park's been there for a long time as well.
Those who live out there, I'm sure, know it well. Those of us who don't
Yeah.
would
Right.
have to hunt for it.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah, but Google helps.
Google helps, yes.
Right.
But what I find interesting, neither of you is a professional astronomer. I mean, you've come to this as an avocation, not a vocation.
That's correct.
And so, Mark, how did you become involved? What attracted you to this hobby?
Well, this was back going into the 60s in high school. Back then, of course, the space program was a big deal. And the tradition back then, in those days, was you made your own telescope from scratch, most people. So people would belong to an astronomy club and they would make their own telescope. And so, you know, that's sort of the do-it-yourself hands-on thing, like flying model airplanes, model trains, ham radio, or build your own telescope. So that was sort of my own personal migration. And it was, of course, appealing because it was scientific and because it had this flavor of being like with the space race. So that was an attractive thing and sort of pulled a lot of us into it back then.
Mark, were you also a hands-on, build-your-own kind of guy?
Yes. I took a mirror-making class at the Adler Planetarium and ground a couple mirrors there and put together homemade telescopes. And then I started out interested in science from science fairs when I was a kid, and same type of thing as Mark with the space race and things like that, and just grew into it.
So I'm intrigued by something you just said about grinding your own mirror. Did you do that as well?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I
but that
guess
was the way it was back in the 60s.
Right.
You know, the economics are very different now.
So that sounds incredibly hard to me. How hard is it to
No,
create
it
your own
doesn't.
mirror?
It takes time and some effort, and being willing to make mistakes and then step back like anything else, like carpentry or anything.
Okay.
So it takes some time. But no, in fact, one of the appeals going back to the 30s, which was Scientific American popularized it actually with a series of books. But going back to the 30s, it was billed as something scientific that a handyman could do, or a handy woman or person nowadays, of
Yes.
course. And so it was, from the very beginning, telescope making was something that was approachable by the average person, with a little bit of guidance.
So how many do you think you built, Mark, in your lifetime?
Well, I made 2 mirrors.
Okay.
And as far as the telescopes themselves, I'm always modifying things. So I have a camera that I use, but the focusing mount wasn't heavy enough to take care of it, so I built the cradle out of PVC pipe. So I'm doing that kind of stuff all the time, just trying to figure out the best way to, kind of use things around the house. But getting back to what Mark said about early in the 30s, they were making these mounts out of pipe fittings and things. So.
Now, these two telescopes that are here in the studio with us, I take it these were bought. In fact, I'm reading a brand name on
Yeah,
one of
these
them.
are
these are
commercial
commercial,
telescopes.
yes.
Yeah, these are commercial.
Celestron on both of them.
Yeah.
Right. So what are the advantages now in today's technology of purchasing something like this versus making your own?
Well, the main advantage, if nowadays, if you bought the mirror blanks and the abrasives, and then paid to have the mirror has to be aluminized, which requires a high vacuum facility. By the time you pay for all that, you can buy a mirror
Okay.
already made.
Yeah.
So the economics have changed very much since we were involved. So if you wanted to make your own telescope, you can buy the mirror, and then the mechanical parts you can do yourself, or you can just buy the whole thing.
And is there an advantage in making your own? Can you do things with a homemade that would be hard to find on the commercial market?
Yes and no, but most people find that they can just go to the commercial market and buy what they need. But as Mark, the example Mark gave, you sometimes have to modify it. So occasionally you have to make modifications to things. For example, when I used this telescope for the eclipse in 2017, I had to remove parts of the focuser so I could reach focus with my camera, because I couldn't reach focus with my camera with the telescope originally. I had to make some tweaks to it. So you have to have, it's not a total consumer hobby unless you spend a great deal of money. There are companies who will help you do that. But if you're trying to do it on a reasonable scale, you invariably have to be a little handy to do things. So those kind of skills come in handy.
Well, it reminds me of many other hobbies that either I have engaged in or friends of mine have. And at some point, any hobby you have ultimately involves gear, stuff.
Yeah.
And you have to become facile with that gear, that stuff. I play with musicians who, if you've ever seen a guitar player, they'll have a set of pedals in front of them that might have as many as 14 different pedals that have to be coordinated. They have to all work together. When you hit one, it has to send its signal through all the others and get back to your guitar and not sound like it's something you just screwed up on. So yes, I think it doesn't surprise me that astronomy is no different. But talk a little bit about the society. What is the objective of the society? What are you trying to accomplish through the Astronomical Society of Fox Valley?
Well, as Mark said earlier, the basic charter is to educate the public and increase the enjoyment of astronomy in the public and amongst our members.
So you do that through what mechanism?
Well, the club meetings always have an educational element to them, as well as companionship. And then the public star parties, which are, both of these, of course, are free to the public. Our public star parties, there's a brief lecture, which is educational. And then if it's clear, then we'll go out and show people the sky and try to encourage them to enjoy it.
And then we also have club star parties that we go out to a dark site far west from here, either at a private location or at a campground. And then we invite club members to that, so we can go out and see the real dark skies versus around here.
So what is the thrill? What is it that attracts you to astronomy even today? I mean, at some point, I would think after you've seen Jupiter or you've taken a picture of Saturn, when you've done it, what keeps you going?
Well, the universe is not static. Solar systems is not static. So there's always something different. And with the technology today, with the cameras and the filters and things like that, and the computerized telescope mounts, you can always refine the art of taking the pictures as well. So I've done many times where I've gone back to the same object, and I've gotten better at my technique of taking the picture or understanding what the sky would give me on any given night. And so I may have 6 or 7 images of the same object over several years, and each one is a little bit different, a little bit better.
Well, I'm sure the objects change over time as well, right? They're celestial objects, and
Well, usually the deep sky objects don't change that much, but the planets do. You see comets, the eclipses. Monday there's going to be a transit of Mercury across the sun, which unfortunately here I don't think we'll be able to see because it's going to be cloudy and snowy that day. But there are events like that. And as an example of our club's mission, last January we had the total eclipse of the moon, if you remember. In the middle of January, it was cold.
January 20th.
I was probably inside, hunkered down, is my bet.
And we had a star party. We had an eclipse party at Peck Farm Park. And we were able to have the barn open so people could warm up, and we had hot chocolate. And Mark, we had 50 to 100 people come out.
Yeah, it was about between 80 and 100,
yeah.
guests.
In the middle of winter. I'm impressed.
Yeah,
It was
but
cold.
lunar eclipses don't happen all the time.
Yeah,
They
yeah, yeah.
happen only every few years.
Yeah.
And they are very beautiful. And it would happen to be, the moon happened to be near a very famous star cluster when it happened, so you could see the darkened moon against this, with this star cluster nearby.
It was
a
on
very
a Sunday
pretty-
night with a holiday the
pretty
next
picture.
day, so
Yeah.
Oh, there
it
you
worked
go.
out great.
Yeah.
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 Now,
It was-
speaking of great beauty, I have heard from those who've been there, not myself, that seeing a total eclipse is almost a life-changing event. Have you guys had that experience?
Yes, I've seen 5 of them, and every one is different, interestingly. I mean, they're not, because the pattern of the outer atmosphere of the sun, the so-called corona, changes depending on the solar cycle. Every eclipse I've seen is different, whether it was in Africa or in Libya or in Columbia, Missouri, Canada. I mean, they're all different. Yes, it is a life-changing experience. It's the only word I can come up with is cosmic. It's the only word that fits it.
Well, it's an apt word.
Yeah.
Mark, have you seen?
No, I have not seen a total eclipse.
I think you
The
got to
last
hang
one
out
that
more
was
with this
here
guy,
was the
right?
partial that I saw.
Okay.
Well, we have one club member who's actually, I think, he's been to maybe a dozen.
Yeah.
He went to one just recently that was down in Chile this last July. And there's going to be another one in December down in Argentina. So it's an excuse to travel, too, if you like.
Yes. There you go.
The next one around here is 2024.
2025.
2025 comes up through Texas and Indiana up to Canada. So
Oh, okay.
I think it's going to pass through Carbondale as
Yes,
well, which the
it'll-
last one did. So it kind of
So you'll be able to
it exits
s-
itself on the
All right. So you can see, you'll be able to actually see totality
for
in
sure.
Carbondale?
If it's
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's-
and quite a long path all the way up towards Indianapolis, going up towards into
Yeah.
Canada. So it's quite a long. The paths of totality can be quite long, and this one, anywhere from Texas up into Canada, you'll be able to see it.
and I think it'll be
Wow.
wider
Yeah,
area too.
Yeah, but the paths of totality are typically 50 miles wide. So you've got to be in that band.
Right.
But
right.
fortunately, thanks to the internet, it's very easy for
To
people to
find.
get maps now that'll show them where the path's going to be.
Right.
I mean, back in the old days, we would literally take a road map of Canada, for example, one time, and we had to draw our own lines on it to know where we could be on the Trans-Canada Highway to see the eclipse.
And
So-
then you have to book accommodations accordingly, right?
Well, we were
So,
camping. We were
camping,
younger, though. That
yeah,
was
yes.
many years ago.
Yes,
So it was
yes.
camping.
So what do you look for now? I mean, when you go out, actually, instead of asking that question, we have some photos here that you guys have taken, and why don't we take a look at that? And then as we walk through that, we'll get to see a little bit of why you guys do this and what the great appeal is, right?
Sounds
So
good.
let's see if we can bring up those photos now. Let's see what we got. Now, right here, it's a little dark, but that's a crater, correct?
Right, that's Crater Copernicus on the moon, and I used a 11-inch f10 telescope and a camera that's kind of like a web camera. It takes like 600 images, and then I use processing to get it clear and sharp.
Okay, so that's a result of a processed image of many images
That's
that you've been
correct.
able to
That's
get that
correct.
level of detail out of it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, with things like the moon and the planets, you actually take many images because the atmosphere is shimmering. And then there is software available that will detect which images are less distorted by the atmospheric shimmering and then just use only those.
Uh-huh.
So it's called stacking.
It's called stacking, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, that makes sense. You stack the images
Right.
on top of each other and
Yeah.
get a composite.
Right,
Right.
but it actually filters them out based on seeing if it sees too much distortion in one image, it kicks it out and doesn't use it.
And I
Which
would
is, again,
imagine-
one of those changes that's come along in the last 10 or 15 years that people can get this kind of software for free and use
I was going to say, I imagine the software is inexpensive, as much software is nowadays.
Well, some of it's quite expensive if it's very specialized and high-end, but there's lots of freeware out there.
That's probably getting better all the time.
Oh,
Sure.
yeah, because it's done by dedicated individuals who have a passion.
Yes, and want to do it.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can come back with some more images. So there's the moon, right?
Yeah, that was the eclipse back in January.
Now,
That was actually taken at Peck Farm Park.
now maybe it's just the coloring of the image. Ah, there's an eclipse. Now, is that an eclipse of the sun or of the moon?
No, that's of the sun.
That's the sun.
Yeah, that's of the sun. That was down in Columbia, Missouri,
So
taken with this telescope.
But if we compare that to the previous image,
Mm-hmm.
so that, in my mind, of what an eclipse looks like, that looks like an eclipse.
Mm-hmm.
But here, the moon, it looks like I'm just looking at the moon on a clear night. How is this? I mean, is that? It looks like a partial eclipse. Is that?
Well,
Well, this is a partial phase of it.
it was just barely total. That eclipse, the there's two parts. There's the shadow of the Earth is like a donut, and there's a dark center, and then there's a ring that's only partially darkened.
Okay.
And that eclipse just barely fell inside the darkened center. So that part of the moon, that limb of the moon at the lower left, was very, very close to being illuminated by the partial shadow. So it's brighter than the rest.
Yeah, well, I
What,
can
what
see
you're
that in
seeing is
picture,
the
yeah.
sunlight passing through the Earth's atmosphere.
That
That's
makes
what
the
that
redding.
gets the red.
Okay.
So the Earth is blocking the sunlight, but enough of it. But
I see, but
Yeah.
there's nothing that curves around the Earth, I would imagine.
Well, it's just the same effect as in, it curves around through the atmosphere of the Earth, and it's reddened just like a sunset. That's what causes that. Now this one, if I had processed it slightly differently, there would have been a slightly different effect.
Okay.
So I stretched the image using software so that I could see that range of brightness that was there to the naked eye.
So I would think it's somewhat akin to the old world of film photography, developing a photo. Various ways to develop it to bring out certain aspects of it that you were looking for.
Yeah.
Right. So the software sounds like a very similar process, right?
right,
Yeah,
we-
but
and
much
we-
less painful.
And when we both went through the photography phase of astrophotography,
The film.
so we love
With
it now
film,
because
yeah.
we don't have to wait 3 weeks to get the picture back.
Or struggle in a dark room, working
Right.
with prints. I
Right.
mean, it was
Messy.
it was awful.
Yes. All right. So here we have Jupiter.
It's Jupiter.
Now it looks blue here, and I always think of it as red. So
Well, it depends again what atmosphere is doing that night and how high it is in the sky. And I think maybe on this one, this is taken with the same camera as the crater of the moon. And I may have processed it a little bit blue to get some contrast in it for the bands on the planet.
now looking at Jupiter, and I think about amateur astronomy, and some years ago, and now of course I can't remember the guy's name, but there was either a comet or an asteroid that hit Jupiter and broke
Right.
up into pieces.
Right.
And
Shoemaker-Levy.
Shoemaker-Levy,
Right.
right. And was a spectacular display, and was identified by an amateur
Yeah.
astronomer, right? So I think the reason I bring that up is that people say, well, what role do amateurs play? Well, here was one where a major event might have been missed altogether had it not been for Shoemaker-Levy, right?
And what's interesting on that, there was a total eclipse of the moon. And again, somebody was taking the images like 600 at a time. And on one of the images, there was an impact on the moon during the eclipse.
This one that just happened.
Okay. And so it was captured in
And
one of those.
by one of the
By an
amateurs
amateur.
that was doing it with modest equipment and was in the right place at the right time.
Serendipity.
Serendipity.
And,
yeah.
and so the more people that are looking up, the more likely it is this sort of thing will be captured.
And so here's a wonderful picture of Saturn. I think my favorite planet, just because it looks
Yeah.
so cool.
Yeah.
Same technique with the 600 frames or whatever, and of course Saturn is changing all the time because the tilt of the rings in relationship to the solar system and the Earth changes all the time.
It does.
So
Well,
sometimes the rings will be a lot more flat than this, and sometimes a little bit more open.
So what is it that's changing? The rings rotate?
Well, actually,
in
the planet's
plane?
always the same. It depends on where you see the planet.
Just like the reason we have seasons on Earth.
Okay.
It's tilted. The orbit of the planet is tilted.
It's tilted. And so depending on what season when you see it, you can
where,
see it
where
from
we
different
are,
angles.
where we are
Well,
in relationship
what part
to
of its
orbit.
season? And its year is 33 of our years. So
Right.
in about 8 years, it'll be edge on. And 8 years later, it'll be in the opposite, it'll be displayed in the opposite orientation. And then 8 years after that, it'll be edge on again.
Oh, that's fascinating. I never knew that.
Yeah, that's why Saturn's the planet of old age in the Roman mythology.
Because it
Because
changes?
most people only see it twice back in those days, maybe just once.
Because
Life
people
expectancy.
didn't live very long
Right.
back then. And so here we have a couple of star clusters, is that?
Those are a pair of nebulas and a pair of star clusters. Yeah, the lower left
Star
is
clusters,
a
yeah.
star cluster, and in the upper ones are two nebulas.
And those have names, the nebula?
Those are called the Heart and Soul Nebula. They also have official designations, which I don't recall. There's a whole bunch
Okay.
of digits in them.
Yeah.
The cluster at the bottom is fortuitously enough, called the double cluster.
Imagine that.
Now, it's in the constellation of Perseus, and if you go out with a pair of binoculars, you can actually see that double cluster. Not quite that bright, of course,
Yeah.
but you can actually see that double cluster with a pair of binoculars.
Fascinating. And so, once again, the colors that we're seeing here, depending on when you take it, how you take it, with what camera, how you process the images, those colors may or may not look like that, right?
Well,
So
actually, in this case, the red is ionized hydrogen,
So it's pretty faithful.
and so that's in the red spectrum.
Okay.
So and then you see the double cluster is blue, so
yeah.
And of course, the human eye loses its color sensitivity at low light levels. So if you were to see those nebulas with your eye, or that nebula, for example, with your
gray.
eye,
Yeah.
it would look grayish,
Ah.
greenish gray.
And now this nebula here that we're looking at
this
is
is called Veil Nebula.
Veil?
Veil Nebula, and this I took in Lombard with filters, and I think it's about 3.5 hours worth of exposure time.
Wow. Now, seems like in that 3.5 hours, a lot could go wrong. Birds could fly in front of your camera.
Well, that was the problem with film. If anything went wrong in your half-hour exposure, you lost everything.
So what I do now, I take 5-minute subs,
Frames, individual frames,
So
and
5
then
minutes.
those are stacked.
and then so 12 5-minute subs,
Per
and those
hour.
are stacked.
Okay.
And if one of those 5 minutes has a plane flying through, it's discarded.
Oh.
Versus having an hour's worth of film
Right.
gone.
Thank
So this is
goodness
what
for the-
attracts me to this now, is that with the technology, you can get stuff done
much more
much more
easily.
efficiently
Yeah.
and have
Yeah.
a lot more fun with it.
And so this is what? Yeah.
This is the center of the Andromeda Galaxy.
Okay.
And I think I took that with my 11-inch telescope as well.
That's our nearest neighbor, Andromeda.
Right. And this you can see with the naked eye at a dark site. You can see the galaxy.
Now,
So that's the furthest thing you can see with the naked eye.
and it's how many light years away?
2.5 million,
Million light years.
am I right?
Something like that.
2.25 million?
Yeah. It changes. They always make slightly improved measurements, but it's in that ballpark. It's far enough away it doesn't,
Yeah. It's a long way.
None of us
Yeah.
were here when that light left.
Yeah, yes. And the species wasn't really here when that light left.
Yeah.
And so this is, I'm guessing, a star party, right?
Yes, this is us out at our club site out near Lee, Illinois. I don't know if it's going to show up on the monitors or not, but from the upper left down towards the tree there, you can see the Milky Way.
Maybe you can.
Yeah,
It's
and
not quite
that's what
sticking out.
people who used to when we were doing film photography, you would be hunched over the telescope, looking through a guiding telescope, so you could keep it center on the object you wanted to shoot, which would be agony for 45 minutes. I mean,
Oh,
it was just
yeah.
awful.
Yeah.
And nowadays, you're sitting at a computer, and the computer is hooked to another camera that actually automatically corrects for the atmospheric movement, for any imperfections in the telescope, and so on. So it's called auto-guiding. So that makes that much easier now. But it's still, like anything else, requires practice and experience. You can't just buy this stuff and do it.
Go out with your laptop and make it all work. Right.
Not the first time. You will eventually.
Right.
That's one of the virtues of belonging to ours or any other astronomy club, is because there are other people there who
Sure.
you can learn from.
Right.
And now, speaking of astronomy and learning, we have these, what I think are magnificent telescopes here in the studio with us. So tell me a little about, let's try the one that's sitting right between the two of you. What is that, and why did you bring that one here?
Well, first of all, because it's very photogenic.
Yes, it
but
looks great.
also because it's a reasonable size. I actually leave this tripod without the telescope on it. I leave this tripod set up in my garage because I can literally pick it out with one hand and carry it out the back door.
Oh, okay.
I have a bigger mount that takes 5 trips, which will hold bigger telescopes.
Right.
But sometimes I don't want to do that. So this one is purely a matter of convenience. It's the type that you point at the North Pole, so that as the Earth rotates, you simply rotate this one. The motors just rotate this one axis to follow the rotation of the Earth.
Ah, and it will be guided by that software that you're talking about in the
Right.
laptop, right?
If I want to use it that way, yes. Yeah. This optical tube I normally use just for visual for public nights or for something like an eclipse of the moon or the sun with this telescope tube.
Now, eclipse of the sun, we've all been told since we were kids, don't look directly at it. But how do you do that with a telescope? Because you are looking directly at, at least the telescope is looking directly at the full eclipse. How do you avoid damage to the telescope or damage to your own eyes? How does that work?
Well, you put a filter up front during the partial phases. So in place of this cap here, which is for keeping dew out, you put a filter that only passes a tiny fraction of the light.
Ah, okay.
Very, very, very highly attenuated filter, like 1 part in 1,000.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that,
But once totality comes, it's perfectly safe to look at the totally eclipsed sun.
oh, really?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Because
I wouldn't go all the way to Africa to see an eclipse if I couldn't see it.
I
wouldn't
suppose
do
that
it.
makes sense. Yes.
Yeah. No, because when the sun is totally eclipsed, which only occurs in that narrow geographical band
Right.
that goes of totality, when the sun is totally eclipsed, you can see stars.
In the middle of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see the
Okay.
brighter stars, which tells you it's not too bright. However, as soon as the totality ends, you need to cover up your eyes or cover up the telescope because of the concerns you mentioned for damage.
And that's because I mean, you could, I mean, not that I normally do this, but you can look at the sun during the day. You can look up and look at the sun, not for very long. But you
No,
can-
your eye, there's a natural reaction to.
Yeah,
turning away,
but it seems like the eclipse is brighter somehow. Is it that it's more focused, or is
No.
it? It's just that people tend to look at it longer.
Yeah, there's a danger of that happening because they're
I
interested
see.
in it.
Yes.
Yeah, and with the proper filters, for example, at this last eclipse, there were you could buy on Amazon or eBay or other places. You could buy special eclipse glasses that were designed for this, and they gave them away at the Adler Planetarium and other facilities like that. But they're to be used during the partial phases. Now here in Chicago in 2017, it was never total, so you
So you
had
them all the time.
you had to have the filters all the time, whether on your telescope or on your eyeballs.
And I take it if you were to look at the sun directly in the non-eclipse situation, that if you did that for the same amount of time that people might look at an eclipse, you'd equally damage your eyes.
Oh,
right?
of course. Yeah.
Because
Oh,
it's
yeah,
just
of
too
course.
bright.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
and
all right.
if you think about it, this lens here or that mirror collects thousands of times more light than your eyeball. So it would be very damaging if the sunlight went in that way, unfiltered.
Directly in and
Aside,
damaging to,
aside from totality.
yeah, to the equipment, damaging to the equipment as well.
Yeah, but the equipment is just, it's a few $100s here or there. It's different than somebody's sight.
Yeah, yes. You can replace that for a couple $100.
Yeah.
Replacing your eyeballs, that's another
That's a
question
one-shot,
altogether,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, so
Right.
that's why people are always cautious about that, and deliberately so. But I can remember once being in the Carolinas in 1969 when people were actually being told to stay inside during the eclipse, like there was something especially dangerous about the sun.
Yeah, but it's not.
You know, the sun-
well, but that, I mean, I would have had the same reaction. I would have thought there's something about an eclipse that makes it especially dangerous, but it's not. It's the human behavior that becomes
Right.
dangerous.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and again, during the partial phases, you wear filters.
Filter glasses, right?
Yeah, on the telescope, on the camera, on your eyeball, and then during totality, though, it's not that bright.
Ah,
It's
so
ghostly.
You can look at it.
Yeah. Well, if you look at that picture there, it was.
Yeah, I can
That was
see,
taken
yeah.
unfiltered, and that was about a half-second exposure. So it was a pretty long exposure, and it was unfiltered.
So we have about 30 seconds left.
Oh.
Is there anything you'd like someone watching to know about the club? What night are your meetings?
We meet on the second Monday of every month.
Second Monday of every month.
Every month.
Okay.
And then the public star party, we have one this Saturday, November 9th at 7 o'clock.
Okay.
And then another one December 7th. And then,
But these can be found on your website.
yes.
as well, right?
Yes.
So those are the next events. And
Well, with that, gentlemen, we're out of time. So I want to thank you so much for being here. I
Thanks
have
for
fun a
having us.
bunch, and I got to come out and watch the stars with you guys.
definitely.
Yeah, and
So-
it looks to be clear this Saturday.
Okay.
So you'll be most welcome, along with anyone else.
Mark Wagner, Mark Christensen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.